welcome to those of you here in person and those of you watching online. We are down to the last 2 weeks of it's been basically a summer-long study through the book of Philippians. And we've titled it Joy Remains because something Sam said a couple weeks ago when he spoke, is he said, if the world can't give us true joy, how can the world take our joy away from us? And there have been so many lessons that have been so amazingly timeless, and the timing of it has just been incredible. As we are going through all this, unique stuff, school started back up and all that, and we thought, let's just lead with God's word and let it speak to us. And almost every week it has spoken to us. We talked about joy in spite of our circumstances, citizenship in heaven, and we are really citizens of another kingdom. As much as we love this country, our loyalty is to the King of Kings and his kingdom. And when Jesus prayed, may your kingdom come on earth as it exists in heaven, part of our job as the church is to usher that kingdom in by continuing what Jesus started. And then last week, I just thought Scott did an amazing job with especially verse 8, because I believe our thinking is critical to our spiritual lives, and so much of how we respond to life and our emotions and how we feel. And I think our thinking, I really believe the spiritual battle in life is fought between our ears. And I see it all the time. And so I want to talk about that today. And like Laura mentioned, the section we're going to look at today, Paul talks about spiritual maturity or spiritual growth, which is something we should all be aspiring to. But I believe it's impossible to grow until we get a hold of our thoughts, until we change our thinking, until we focus on the right things. And I want to put a slide up that Scott had up last week and just kind of remind you of what Paul says we should be thinking about in verse 8. We should be thinking about things that are true and lovely and noble and admirable and right and excellent and pure and praiseworthy. And yet I'm challenged to think about some of the stuff that I put in my head every day, some of the stuff. And I want to be able to focus on those things. I want to be able to think right thoughts, proper thoughts, godly thoughts, spiritual thoughts. But there's so much stimulus coming at us, so much information coming at us that is anything but that. So how do we change that? How do we do better at thinking this? About a year ago, I was doing a series on the soul. And I talked about this thing called an amygdala hijack. Any of you remember that? Okay, good. I was glad a few of you, because I thought I didn't really imagine that I talked about that. I think I really did talk about that. And I think the key is to not allow our amygdalas to be hijacked. So let me give you a very brief, very novice neuroscience lesson on how our brains work. An amygdala hijack refers to a personal emotional response that is immediate, overwhelming, and out of measure with the actual stimulus because it has triggered a much more significant emotional threat. Now, just a little anatomy lesson. The amygdala is the irrational part of our brain, and that's the first thing that our senses pick up. It's the first thing that is hit. It's kind of that flight or fight or flight part of our brain where, that irrational part of our brain. Now, our neocortex is the rational part of our brain. Now, the problem is the immediate response is often from our amygdala. You see something visually, and there's a fear or there's a reaction. You hear something, you read something, and immediately you react and you respond. And we see this. We are seeing amygdala hijacks all around us every day, aren't we? I mean, it's like we are reacting and responding. And what it does is it allows our minds to be filled with stuff that is not what Paul referred to in verse 8. It allows those negative stimuli or those frightening stimuli to take over, and we respond in kind, and we wonder why we are an emotional wreck. So how do we stop that? Well, it takes a few seconds to get to the neocortex. So how do we stop that hijack from happening and give it just a few seconds to move into the rational part of our brain? Well, Paul gives us an amazingly wonderful piece of advice in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. And it goes like this. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge, that verse 8 thinking, against the knowledge of God, that which is true and right and pure and noble. We set up we set up our brains, our minds, our thoughts in a way that we allow God's truth to captivate us. And then he goes on, and this is the key right here. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. When you feel that stuff coming in, when you feel yourself into that mental death spiral, immediately grab hold of it, take those thoughts captive, and say, Jesus, here they are. Easier said than done, but you've got just a few seconds to do that before your mind is filled with whatever it should be filled with. So when you find that negative stimulus coming in, take captive those thoughts and present them to Christ, and then your mind begins to focus on the knowledge of God, which is logical and rational and good and pure and true. Now, I say all that to say, until we learn to do that, it will be almost impossible for us to mature spiritually, because we will continually find ourselves stuck in this kind of infantile or adolescent spiritual/emotional state. And if the battle is fought between our ears, we got to get a hold of this. And so Paul gives us not just great advice on how to take negative thoughts or all thoughts captive and present them to Christ so that God's knowledge fills our thoughts. He also gives us some examples of what that looks like. And that's what we're going to be looking at today as we continue our study in Philippians. Now, maturity is something that is something we would all aspire to. Like Laura said, it is important to grow. It is important to mature. And Paul talks about spiritual maturity here in Philippians. So today, we're going to be looking at Philippians 4, and we're going to begin with verse 10. And we're going to look at two aspects of maturity. We're going to look at personal maturity, how we as individuals grow. And Paul serves as an amazing example of a life of mature spiritual faith. And then we're going to talk about corporate maturity. Just more briefly, what does it look like to be a mature church? So let's dive in with verse 10, and let's look at what Paul, I would say as we look at Paul's life, there are four characteristics that Paul really exemplifies, especially in these few verses, that's something we could really aspire to. It's four aspects of maturity that Paul gives us. The first aspect of a mature person, a mature believer, is they are affirming of other people. In verse 10 of chapter 4, Paul says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. Paul could have had an ongoing pity party for himself. He's under house arrest, unfairly tried, unfairly persecuted. The church is just beginning to get started. He's the first and foremost and lead missionary. He's the pastor of all the pastors. And here he is. He can't even go visit these young churches. He's stuck under house arrest in Rome. And he could have felt sorry for himself, but instead what he does is he affirms those believers in Philippi, saying, keep going, keep maturing, keep doing what you're doing. He's building into them instead of going, hey guys, pray for me. My life is so hard, it's unfair, I'm in prison, I'm in jail, I can't do anything about it. I think part of how we respond to stuff is up to us. Are we seeing it through an eternal lens? You see, Paul, instead of feeling sorry for himself, like the churches are all going to dwindle and fall apart without me, and I can't really do my ministry because I'm stuck here under house arrest, instead of feeling sorry for himself, he looked at it from God's perspective. He affirmed them, and he says, guys, keep going. Keep running this race. You see, this is so very, very important. Because immature people have a hard time affirming other people, complimenting other people, encouraging other people, don't they? This is a rhetorical question, but have you ever been in a relationship with someone when every time you're with them, you could spend hours with them, they never ask you anything about yourself? The conversation's always about them and their life, and they don't even realize it. You're on a phone call with people like that, and they talk about themselves incessantly. They don't ask you about yourself. So while they're talking, you can put the phone down, go in the other room, get a sandwich, have lunch, come back, and they didn't even notice you were gone. You ever been around people like that? Don't be nudging the person next to you if you think they're like that, because they might be. But a sign of maturity is other-centeredness. You know, I think the opposite of jealousy, I just thought of this. The opposite of jealousy, I think, is affirmation. People who are extremely insecure and jealous of other people have a hard time complimenting other people for fear that it'll lower them and put the other person above themselves. But as Christ followers, shouldn't we always be considering others before ourselves and affirming them? Not just complimenting them, but look for those, find them doing something good. Find them doing something right, and let them know. You know, a couple weeks ago, one of our daughter-in-laws lost her grandmother, and she posted the sweetest post on Facebook about her grandmother. And I just thought, you know what? I don't want to let this moment go by. So I just texted her, and I said, you are one of the kindest, most thoughtful people that I know. I did not want to let that opportunity go. Affirmation, a sign of maturity. A second thing that Paul exemplifies in us is contentment. In verse 11, one of those famous verses that, you know, we often think of in Philippians, where he says, I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. Wow. Now that's a tough one, isn't it? I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. Paul had absolutely no reason to be content, but he was. You know, I heard this years ago. I was at a conference or something, and the speaker asked, are you a thermostat or are you a thermometer? Are your emotions dependent upon the environment around you? Like, you know, a thermometer just reads the room. It reads the temperature. But a thermostat controls the temperature. What do you do? Are you consistent or are you continually influenced? It's interesting, the word that Paul uses here, the Greek term translated content, does not mean I don't care what happens. This is an unusual term that suggests self-sufficient. Now, in the context of this letter, it means that being at peace in Christ's sufficiency. Paul's contentment is because of Christ, and he talks about this a couple verses later, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But how could Paul adapt and endure? I mean, this guy went through a lot. What was it that relieved the tension and allowed him to be so relaxed within? He was convinced that Christ was in the midst of his everyday, pouring his power into him every day. And you see, when we believe that, anything is bearable and nothing is out of control. Is your contentment based upon your circumstances or your relationship with Christ? Sign of maturity is contentment. And then there's this third characteristic of maturity that Paul really exemplifies in verse 12. It's flexibility. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Flexibility. You see, Paul has seen it all, and yet he remains flexible. He goes, well, I'm going to be content whether I'm well-fed or hungry, whether I'm free or whether I'm in jail. He goes, I've just learned the secret of contentment. He'll share it with us in the next verse. But I believe, one of the things that I've really begun to see coming out of this last, 2020 is going to be a year for the ages. I think individuals and organizations that remain flexible are going to come out of this much better than those who are like, nope, I'm not doing this until everything's back to normal. Well, good luck with that. I believe churches that are saying, well, we're not going to do this or we're not going to do that until it's normal. We don't know what normal is going to come back. We don't know if it's ever going to come back. We don't know what normal is. Are we willing to adapt and be flexible and do what it is that God asks us to do? And just go with it. And I have to tell you, I have been deeply challenged by this year. I'm not an extremely flexible person. I wouldn't say that I'm a total off-the-chart type A, completely rigid, but man, I like to have control of things. I like to set up things in such a way that the end result will have a favorable outcome. I like to set up my life that way, and when it doesn't happen, man, it really can unravel me at times. I know early on in this, when we couldn't have church and we kept trying this and we were wrong about that, I was beside myself. I really was. I was so bummed for a couple weeks, and then finally I'm like, okay, God, fine. You win. You win. Have it your way. He's like, thank you. I thought, if I don't do this and if we don't do that, it's going to be a disaster. And you know what I think I've been taught finally at 62 years old? I'm not in control. I've never been in control. I just lived under the illusion that I was. And not that I don't ever and won't ever struggle with this again, but I got to tell you, I'm experiencing as much freedom in ministry as I have ever experienced, because it's like, okay, God, I'm going to show up today and I'm just going to be faithful. Whatever you have. And maybe that's a sign that I'm finally maturing. So maybe I'm in late adolescence spiritually. I don't know. But flexibility is a sign of spiritual maturity. And then lastly, he talks in verse 13, the mother of all famous verses, that if you were ever going to get a tattoo, this is the one. A mature believer is confident in Christ. This is the key to all of it in verse 13. Every single thing that Paul says, here is the key. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. He doesn't say I can do all this because I'm all that. He says I can do all this because of him, period. And man, when we can get to that point, it's an amazing thing. You know, they say that adversity builds character, right? You've heard that? And adversity reveals character. I think the same is true of maturity. I think difficult times can build our maturity, or it can reveal our maturity. And I guess the question I thought about that I would ask you, because I've been asking myself that, what have you learned about yourself in 2020? What have you learned about the state of your spiritual life in 2020? What have you learned about your maturity, your spiritual maturity in 2020? I've learned some things that I'm like, okay, I'm doing all right. And I've learned some things where I'm like, whew, man, I've got some growth ahead of me. What has COVID-19 revealed to you about you? Maybe I'll ask your spouse that question. What has COVID-19 revealed to you about your spouse, or about your children, or about your parents, or about your friends? You see, difficult times reveal a lot about us, but they also give us great opportunities for growth. Well, Paul shifts, and he talks a little bit about corporate maturity, what it means to be a mature church. And I want to spend just a few minutes on that, just to encourage us as we move forward to continue to become a more mature body of believers. A mature corporate maturity, you know, he talks in basically three different marks of a mature church. The first one is a mature church is a compassionate church. It is a church that really thinks about how can we show the love of Christ to others. And he talks about the Philippian church in this way. He says in verse 14, "Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles." Now understand, these Christians don't have a lot. They're under persecution. And yet he's saying, man, you guys have been compassionate. Verse 15, "Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only." You see, what is our reputation in our community? My prayer as we move forward, as things continue to progress, that we would become more and more known as a church full of people who truly love their community, who are compassionate in all sectors of our community. And how can we get better at that? How can we become more of a church that we take this body, this church, more effectively into our community? How do we bring the church out there? A mature church is a compassionate church. It loves the people around it, whether they agree with them or not, whether they deserve it or not, because we didn't deserve it, right? And yet we are recipients of God's amazing grace. We need to be a conduit to extend that to our community. A mature church, Paul says, is also a generous church. Verses 16 and 17, he says, "For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need." And he knew they didn't have a lot to give. They went without when they gave to the church. Not that I desire your gifts. What I desire is that more be credited to your account. You know, Jesus said it, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And then lastly, he says a mature church is one that shows sacrificial commitment. In verse 18, he says, "I have received full payment and have more than enough. I am amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. They are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. And may this be said of us, that we are a church that is sacrificially committed, that we do what we say, that we maintain our commitments, even when it is sacrificial, not just when it is convenient. So let me shift gears a little bit here, and I've been so looking forward to this part of our service today. But let me say a couple things first. Friday morning, I was driving to Fort Wayne pretty early in the morning, and I noticed all these flags at half-mast, and I was like, oh man, today's 9/11. And man, it brought me immediately back to that morning 19 years ago. So I was in my car and I thought, I'm going to call my friend Steve Wise, who is our tech director, and all the cool stuff you see up here and all that. Thank you, Steve, and your amazing team. You guys do an incredible job. But I called Steve and I said, Steve, you remember 19 years ago this morning when I walked into our offices on Enterprise Drive and you were the first person that greeted me and said, you won't believe what happened. He was listening to WOWO radio and he goes, a plane flew into one of the World Trade Center buildings. And I was thinking like a little 4-person plane or something, and we know the rest of the story. And I was brought right back. That was one of those moments that if you're old enough, you remember as though it was yesterday, and it was 19 years ago. And we're on this family thread, and one of my sons sent the video, which I still tear up when I see it because of all the pressure that he must have been under when President Bush threw out the first pitch in Yankee Stadium of the 2001 World Series. And I mean, he nailed it. It was just such a powerful moment. And I just remember how disorienting it was. And it was the week before. We were meeting that next Sunday for the first time at Lakeview Middle School. And we showed up on Sunday morning. We didn't know what to expect. And I knew that I needed to kind of address it and kind of go speak God's truth into this in some way. It's one of those moments where you feel overwhelmed as a leader and as a pastor. And I remember we had the hugest crowd that we'd ever had up to that point because people were just reeling from this. And I say all that to say there are moments in history that you remember. If you're old enough, you remember when the space shuttle blew up. You remember right where you were. If you're old enough, you remember where you were when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And I say that because I saw that through 9/11, God did something in his church that was remarkable. We grew because people suddenly came alive and said, I'm hungry, I want answers, I need something. I think we're living in one of those times. None of us alive today who are old enough to remember this will forget 2020, when the world stopped. And yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, and certainly the church has struggled with so many other institutions and organizations. But I was reminded Friday morning of Jesus' words, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not stand against it.